Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Lumud Live in partnership with the South African Jewish Report. My name is Sean Mattison. I'm a non-executive director of the South African Jewish Report, and we're extremely excited to partner with Lumud for tonight's event. I'm your host for the session. So it is an online session, but like at Lumud, we'd like everyone to engage both with Lumud values and in particular to use the chat as appropriately to ask any questions. So we're extremely privileged to have Miri Eisin here. Her presentation is War and Peace, the 2020 Middle East version. So we had a brief intro in the discussion with Howie. So Miri, we're extremely excited to hear from you. Just for everyone, Miri is a retired Israeli colonel, an expert in security, intelligence, and diplomacy, a teacher at the IDC in Herzliya, and presents worldwide on Middle Eastern geopolitics. We're extremely privileged to have Miri here. So we're really looking forward to her presentation. Please do use the chat if everyone wants to go and tell us where they're from. Miri will speak for about 40 minutes and we'll have about 5 minutes of Q&A. So please post your questions in the chat and I'll do my best to facilitate the right questions and the right themes that come about. So once again, thank you for joining us, and Miri, over to you.
Thank you so much. So we're going to hope that technology is going to work with us, that I'm going to be able to talk to you here from Ramat Sharon, next to Tel Aviv. I want to share with you this evening some of the main aspects of 2020 of what I like to call war and peace. Sean, my request is that if there are problems with the technology, tell me, I'll stop. We always know internet can come and go, and I won't always know that. So I'm sitting here right now. I am going to be sharing. I will every once in a while try, if possible, to stop and to let you know what's going on, but just give me a nod. Sean, can everybody see what I shared?
Yes, we can, Miri, and we can hear you fine. So far,
Excellent.
so good.
Eze kef, yefeh me'od. So here we are, it's 2020. Some of you are sitting looking at me at a telephone or at a computer, maybe even in a bigger one, like in a TV screen. And what I put on the screen for you right now is a very big overview of the greater Middle East, North Africa, looking all of the way towards Europe. And here we are in 2020, and I want to remind you, it's only August. 3 years ago in August, I was happily and lovingly hosted by the South African wonderful Jewish community at Lumud in South Africa. It was an amazing trip, but that was in 2017. When I want to talk about 2020, when I want to focus on war and peace in the Middle East in 2020, in this time of the pandemic, I actually need to remind all of us a little bit about this year. So let's go on a little bit of a tour of this year. Tour number one. When we talk about January, we're talking about, think about the words, the taking out, the killing, the assassination, the targeted killing of Qasem Soleimani, the commander and establisher of what is called, and I want you to take note of these words, it'll be connected later on. He was the commander and establisher of the Al-Quds force, a force called Al-Quds. Most of you will know it, that it's called the Holy Force, an Iranian force, Qasem Soleimani, killed by the United States at the beginning of January. So that was January, right? That was only 8 months ago. And then you go, wow, isn't August the best month ever? Here we are right now. All of us get a smile on our face. All of us take notice and go. After 25 years, really 26 years, since the peace agreement that was signed between Israel and Jordan in October of 1994, for the first time in 26 years, we are having a treaty up the alley, supposed to be happening in the upcoming weeks, but there are already the feelings around it. I'll talk about that a bit further, where the United Arab Emirates, For me, a place that I couldn't go to. If we think about it in that sense, from South Africa, you can fly to Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Emirates, that's just the airlines. For Israelis, these were areas that were sort of closed off. If you had two passports, it would have been a little bit more open. What changed so dramatically in 2020 that brought about two very different events? January 2020, the killing of Qasem Soleimani, and August of 2020, the budding peace agreement that's supposed to be happening between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. So rather than directly dive into that, I'm going to do a zoom out. I want us to talk right now about the possibility of other aspects that very much impact the Middle East, that impacted Israel within the Middle East, but overwhelmingly impacted United Arab Emirates and the countries that surround Israel. And I'll be addressing every one of them in a moment to talk about what happened and what has changed, and into all of that in this war and peace, how COVID-19 also bites in. So what am I trying to do this evening? I'm going to be talking about reasons for war, about reasons for peace, but to do so, I want to introduce you to basic elements of Middle East of 2020 that did not start this year, but all of them became slightly more extreme. So what am I talking about? In January, we had, in addition to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, peace with prosperity, or the United States administration's plan for peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And right now we are in that second wave of COVID-19. And in that second wave, as we're looking at it, we're wondering how that's going to impact us. And I'm going to dive right in. In the Middle East of 2020, in Israel that I'm sitting in right now, as an exception to the Western world, but in the Middle East in which I'm sitting outside of my window, I can see the Mediterranean Sea. When we look at the greater Middle East, the biggest challenge that the Middle East faces right now is numbers, is demographics. But not just any demographics. The demographics that totally impact the greater Middle East are the demographics of youth. So I don't know about all of you, but I, who live here in Israel, I have 3 kids. In Israel, and I don't know how it is in South Africa, it's one of the only places I know that people will come up to me and say, 3 kids? Why don't you have a 4th? It's kind of like, really? I have to explain that? In Israel, on average, regular, secular, non-religious, active practicing will have 3, 4, 5 children. But I want you to look at the Middle East right now. Because in the Middle East and North Africa, from Morocco to Iran, every single one of the countries that you're looking at, think of what I'm going to say right now, half the population is under the age of 25. I need to give you an example. I need to put this in an area to try and understand what this means. Israel borders Egypt. In 1979, that was the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. In 1979, Israel was 3.4 million people. Egypt was, at the time, 34 million people, exactly 10 times the size of Israel. So you go 10 times the size. They were 34. We were 3.4. For those who don't know, Israel today is over 9 million citizens, which is amazing. Egypt, that you could see on the map in front of you, over 100 million citizens, meaning Egypt has, under the age of 41, over 65 million citizens. What does that mean that under the age of 40, you have 65 million citizens? Think of what that means in terms of youth, how many people you have from the age of 15 to 25. But I want you to think about it like your families. What does that mean on how many schools were built, on how many universities were built, on how many jobs were created, on where people can get their next step in life? And every single one of the countries of the greater Middle East, from Morocco to Iran, have enormous youth populations. And people like to think of this as something which is bad. And I look at that and go, but this is actually amazing. It's their future if you govern, if you build, if you create both the jobs and the opportunities. But what we're talking about in the greater Middle East is half the population under the age of 25. And for the last 15 years, half the population of the Middle East wants to live, the Arabic speaking countries, they all want to live in the United Arab Emirates. How does that connect to the peace between Israel in that sense and the United Arab Emirates? The United Arab Emirates, for this enormous youth population, is seen as being a place where, as a youth, as a 25-year-old, as a 30-year-old, A, you'll be able to get a job. B, you'll be able to stay with your Arabic culture, language, prestige, with the feeling of belonging without being in a Islamic state version where you can go and not just get a job, but you can work and you can be in a place that gives you the sense of a future, the sense of belonging, and overwhelmingly, and this is an important term for within the Middle East, with a sense of pride. So here we are, Middle East 2020, United Arab Emirates is the country that this enormous youth population wants to move to. Ladies and gentlemen who are watching from all over the world, as far as I could see, because I saw before from Australia to the United States, so you really are all over the globe, not just in South Africa. The enormous youth of the greater Middle East, and again, look at that from Morocco all the way to Iran. Not only is half the population under the age of 25, but that enormous youth population is overwhelmingly unemployed. This was before COVID-19. What happens when COVID-19 steps in is that it makes everything that much worse. It makes it that much harder. So here we are in 2020 with this enormous youth population, where in that youth population, they feel they don't have a future, they can't get a job, they can't get education the way that they want. They look at United Arab Emirates as being the one place where, as Arabs, as individuals, they'd be able to grow and not necessarily in other areas. And in that arena, in that youth unemployment, stepping into this arena, they look around themselves and they view themselves also through Muslim eyes. This isn't about Islam or Christianity as in other Abrahamic monotheistic religions. There are different religions out there, different aspects of religiosity. But I want to remind us all that when we talk about the Muslim population in the world, the largest Muslim population in the world is not in the Middle East. The largest Muslim population in the world is in Southeast Asia. The 5 largest Muslim countries in the world are, if I go through them right now, in the most populated, not the largest physically, Indonesia, and then Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the Muslim minority in India. Those are the 4 most populated Muslim countries. Number 5 is also not in the Middle East. It's kind of halfway between where I am in Israel and where a lot of you are in South Africa. That's Nigeria. Those are the 5 most populated Muslim countries in the world. And only number 6 is going to be Egypt with the 100 million people. But when I give you that in the background, an enormous youth population in the greater Middle East, and overwhelmingly an enormous population that is Muslim, I want to remind us all in the COVID-19 era that when you're approaching people and you want them to be healthy and you want them to be safe, and it's 2020 and our world has changed so much, that the biggest battle that the different countries are fighting right now is the battle against COVID-19. And that has changed some of the criteria, the way that they look at things, their priorities when it comes to what's important. It's not just about, in that sense, that religious aspect and that belonging. And I think that the strongest or the harshest, it depends how we look at it, example that we have right now in the Middle East of what COVID-19 has done to the Middle East was certainly in the last 2 weeks during the annual pilgrimage, Hajj, to the holy sites in Saudi Arabia. In this infogram, you're seeing the Kaaba. I want you to take the moment, for those who didn't follow, to get an idea of what it means. Look at the two different pictures of the before and after COVID-19, where the holiest site for Muslims who can come at any time on a pilgrimage, and it was closed to them. The pilgrimage, the Hajj, is one of the 5 pillars of a religion that encompasses 2 billion believers in the world, 2 billion believers. And look at that after of the Kaaba, where the whole arena, the whole area of the holy site in Mecca has been closed to the public. It was entirely closed from March during the holy pilgrimage of the holiday of the Hajj, which took place 2 weeks ago. They opened it up for 10,000 people. Just to give you an idea, last year in that same area that you're seeing, not inside the one arena, but in the city of Mecca during that whole time, because they walk around and they wander and they walk, 3 million people. From 3 million to 10,000 is an event which impacts them. And I go back for a second and I remind you, the health and the safety of Muslims is the priority. But who stopped the people from coming? The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Who did they stop? They stopped all of the Muslims in the world. That means Muslims from Southeast Asia. That means Muslims from all over the Middle East, or from Europe, or from Africa. They're everywhere in the world. And when it comes to the greater Middle East, issues like this become issues of war and peace. When we talk about the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia right now trying to open itself up a bit, a tad, not too much, towards the world to be perhaps a bit less conservative, the events of COVID-19, of trying to keep together a country for its health, for its safety. But when they stop the Hajj, when they stop the pilgrimage from all of the world into the holy sites of Islam, it doesn't just impact the Saudis, it impacts every Muslim in the world. So I mentioned 2 aspects of the greater Middle East that will come into where we are right now. Element number 1, enormous youth. Element number 2, the Islamic aspect of the greater Middle East and North Africa as the strongest and biggest and largest and most populous religion within this arena. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and what it had to do because of the Hajj this year and the fact that they're not allowing in pilgrims. I want to add in an additional African dimension. When we talk about Middle East and North Africa, it's clear to everybody that I'm adding into that. Certainly Egypt, when you talk about the MENA countries, Middle East and North Africa, you're adding into that also. Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, that I showed on the maps before. So when I'm talking about the Middle East and North Africa right now in 2020, an incredibly important event happened in the last month, and this one has to do with water or the lack thereof. And it happened in Africa, and it impacts the greater Middle East. Inside the greater Middle East and North Africa, water is a crisis that is already with us. But what happened over the last month and a half is that for the first time, Ethiopia, with the Grand Renaissance Dam, started to fill up. You can see on the left-hand picture a photograph when they started to fill up the dam. And in the right-hand map, you can see the River Nile as it starts from Lake Victoria in that area of the countries that surround Lake Victoria with the White Nile, as it flows to the north through the different countries, and the Blue Nile that starts in Ethiopia, and the two of them meet in the Sudanese city of Khartoum, and then they flow into Egypt. What did I just say before, 3 minutes ago? That Egypt is a country of over 100 million people. Do you understand what I just said? In 2 weeks in July, the last 2 weeks of July, Ethiopia started to fill a dam, which is on the River Nile, which means that they stopped the regular flow of the River Nile downstream through Sudan, through Egypt. Who owns the River Nile's waters? Who gets to choose who uses the River Nile's waters? This issue in the greater Middle East of war and peace that's happening around us, very dramatic this summer, not just in that sense of peace. Ethiopia has been talking both with Sudan and with Egypt over how they want to fill that dam so that they'll be able to make enough electricity for Ethiopia and Sudan and Egypt and Eritrea. We're talking about something good. Electricity is something which brings technology and capabilities to all of these areas that need it. But they stopped the flow without any coordination, the flow of the great River Nile. Now, I want to go backwards for a moment. It's already 60 years ago when Egypt opened and inaugurated the Aswan Dam, which is in Egypt. And I find it amusing that they write it as Lake Aswan and not about the Aswan Dam on the map, because the lake was created because they dammed the river. But let's be clear, when Egypt dammed the River Nile, they dammed it in Egypt and they regulated the water for Egypt. It mainly impacted Egypt. When Ethiopia dams the River Nile, they're stopping the flow, both for Ethiopians to help them fill this dam and have electricity, but they're stopping the flow of water that goes through Sudan, a country of 40 million people, and Egypt, a country of 100 million people. And these are enormously important issues that come up all of the time. So, talked a bit about youth, talked a little bit about Islam, talked a little bit about water, and I arrive at governance. So I follow South African politics, but not enough. I certainly don't understand it at all. And I think that every country has its issues with governance. I live inside Israel. Let's put it mildly. We're all challenged right now, no matter where we are on the political map, over how we are doing or not doing governance in Israel at this time of COVID-19. At this time, we're in the second wave, we're not doing too well. But I'm showing you right now the governance or the leaders or the dictators of all of the different Middle East and North African countries from Morocco to Iran, but in two different sections. Because when we talk about war and peace in the Middle East in 2020, we have to separate between the upper level, that doesn't make them better, who are the members of the Arab League states from the Middle East and North Africa. They're all Arabic-speaking leaders. Right plop in the middle, you can see the King Salman. I mean, just to give you an idea, this is King Salman of Saudi Arabia, and we can see the King of Jordan, and we can see the Palestinian Authority President, which is the way I would call it. Many of you are from South Africa. You will call this the Palestine president. I'm not in that sense, but we have also here the Kuwaiti, the Emirati, the Lebanese, all of these different leaders that we're seeing in the two lines here. And below them, we are seeing three different leaders. Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Bashar Assad, who is the Syrian president, and Ali Khamenei, who is the supreme religious leader of Iran. Why am I showing them all right now? Because I will pose to you that every single one of these leaders that we're seeing here right now has pretty much failed at the issue that I call governance. And when I say failed, they have not created the jobs for their youth. They have not contended with COVID-19. They have not built schools, education, technology. Who are the only leaders in the greater Middle East who are seen as having delivered? The one is the United Arab Emirates. As I said, it's not a democracy, it's not coming from there, but they're perceived as a country that has delivered to their youth. And I'll talk in a bit as we go on the different countries.
Miri.
Yes.
Sorry, Miri. We have a graffiti artist here. If I can ask you to please disable annotate screen share on your computer, stop this screen sharing, reactivate the screen sharing, and disable annotate.
What did you want me to disable?
Disable annotate screen sharing.
I don't even see where I have that. Okay, I disabled the screen
Go
sharing.
under, when you screen share, then you will go to your security. And it's at the bottom of the list.
I'm like totally, okay.
Reshare your screen.
Okay.
Now go to security.
Tell me where to go look. Is that a display settings?
Security, it's at the bottom of your screen on the bar.
Yes, this is that stage in life where we all love each other. Okay.
You see it?
For some reason, I don't. Okay.
If you have it over the button, move your mouse to the bottom of the screen.
I'm stopped sharing again. Just a sec, okay? Because I'm like, okay, I'm sharing. Da, 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 da. This happens to me every single time. It's like to drive everybody nuts, right? Is it working okay now?
Now hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen.
Yeah.
Go to security.
It's not coming up, sorry. I can just stop sharing again. This is so bizarre.
Miri, it seems to have stopped. If you can't do it, I would just carry on with the presentation.
Okay, let me just talk in that sense, meaning you're not seeing the share screen at all.
No, if you could share
we
again,
can't see anything.
But we've got rid of the graffiti artist, so let's give it another go.
Okay, can you see the screen now, just so that I know
Yes,
if I'm talking? Okay, thank you, and I appreciate that. I'm sorry, I have no idea. Okay, we're good?
Good to go. Keep going. Thanks.
All right, sorry. No, absolutely. So until now, to close caption in that sense, we talked a bit about the aspect of Middle East 2020, enormous youth, overwhelmingly Muslim as a self-identity, as something that they see as part of their future, the challenges of water and how that can have an impact within the greater Middle East. And right now I'm focusing on the governors or governance that you can kind of see in front of you. And I want to take you for a moment into the war zone of the Middle East that all of us are ignoring, and that's called that country that we used to call Syria. I'm not going to talk now about the Syrian war, but I want to remind you just of the elements that are impacting us in 2020. Element number one is the enormous aspect of refugees, because 2020 came, the war still continues, and what's happening in the greater Middle East is where all of these refugees are. In Turkey, okay, that's kind of far away. In Lebanon, bordered with Israel, in Jordan, in Iraq, enormous numbers of Syrian refugees. It's a huge issue. I'll address it in a moment when it comes to Lebanon. But in addition to the refugees, when we talk about the Syrian war, one of the aspects of it that we felt better about last year, and I'm showing you this slide from last year, was that at least we managed to destroy what was invented in this war, expanded in this war, and then essentially the entire world got together to destroy it, the Islamic State. Doesn't this map make you feel kind of better? You look and you go, God, the Islamic State, it was terrible, it was huge, but then it got less and less, and then there's 2019. So I'm going to be the prophetess of doom, and I am the one who's going to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, the Islamic State has not disappeared. It was not destroyed. It was not destroyed in Syria, and not only that, but when most of the people there dispersed after the physical territorial destruction of the area called the Islamic State in Syria and in Iraq, you know what they did? They went home. And when they went home, they came both back into Europe at that small numbers, much larger numbers. Remember that map before of Islam, Southeast Asia, issues which are up there now. In Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Pakistan, in the countries of Southeast Asia. But I'm looking right now at a map that also includes Africa. And I give you that in that background because over the last 6 months, under COVID-19, in this horrific time period where you're looking around and going, how do we fight COVID-19? One of the things that's happened is that everybody is supposed to be in their house at home, secluded isolation, and the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda have both been raising a flag, finding their voice, both inside Syria and in other places. For Israel, it's very disturbing. It's both in Syria, it's also in Egypt, but in Egypt, an ally, a country that has a peace treaty with us, they're a country that needs somebody to come and help, and Israel needs to step up. In addition to the Islamic State, one of the aspects of what's in Syria and in the aftermath of that war, and to me this is the strongest point that I want to talk about, is the implications of Hezbollah and especially of Qasem Nasrallah that you're seeing right now in the photograph. Okay, I know that I can usually talk in English, and I'm sure that most of you understand my English. I don't know how many of you can think right now offhand of somebody who talks and you sit listening, riveted. You just want somebody to keep on talking. You just want somebody to keep on explaining reality to you, to be giving you the way things are. Because ladies and gentlemen, I want you to look right now at Qasem Nasrallah. You are looking at what is the strongest, most charismatic, it doesn't matter the looks. This is about a man who knows how to talk, who knows how to persuade, who knows how to talk, not in Persian. People think of him as an Iranian. He is a Lebanese, Arabic-speaking, Lebanese-born, Arabic-speaking Shiite. And he is eloquent, and he is talking, and he is persuading, and he is on Israel's borders. Inside Lebanon, and this connects into the horrific explosion that was there already 2 weeks ago. Hezbollah, for the last 20 years, has been rebranding itself. And 2020 is the year where this rebranding is coming out. It always has been negative as far as I'm concerned as an Israeli, but the rebranding has brought up Hezbollah to ask a very clear-cut question as we look at it. Look at the different aspects of it, but Hezbollah in the last 20 years has been doing two things that don't always work together. And it's not just about the explosion. None of us know who did the explosion, or if it just happened from a fire in the most worst negligence that there is in having that amount of chemical, that ammonium that was there inside the port. Hezbollah, last 20 years, has been at the forefront of the Shiite revolution. That's something which is worldwide. That's something that's way beyond Arab. That's something which is all over Africa, South America, anywhere they can be at. You have Hezbollah in Indonesia and Malaysia and in the Philippines. You have Hezbollah in South America. You have Hezbollah in Yemen and throughout the Middle East. But at the same time, Qasem Nasrallah, you see him with his mask on his face there? Hezbollah have chosen to also, as they are Lebanese, Arabic speaking, and they are one of the 18 different denominations, religions, confessions that are officially part of the government there, the Shiites, Hezbollah is not only in the government, they have held over the last 4 years the health portfolio. They are the ones who are responsible for the COVID-19 response. They are the ones, in that sense, the Hezbollah minister in the government was the one who's responsible for that response. And you see Qasem Nasrallah, and I look at that and I go, what is he more? Lebanese, responsible for his Lebanese people, his constituents, or is he the head of the Shiite revolution? Because the explosion that happened in Beirut, as it happened and what has evolved from that, has been Hezbollah saying, it isn't us. We're Lebanese. Oh, it must be somebody outside. It's probably the Israelis, which is such shtuyot, it's such negligence of everybody. It wasn't necessarily Hezbollah in that sense. Certainly they didn't want anything of the sort to happen. But when you look at what that does to an organization like Hezbollah, a horrific combination of incompetence, but especially of asking them, who do they want to be? Hezbollah is not only the one that is in the government, supposed to be taking care of COVID-19, it is overwhelmingly on the borders against Israel. So what is Hezbollah? Are they against Israel? Are they the Shiite revolution? Are they a Lebanese political party? Can they be all of the above? When I look at what's happening now in 2020, the response to the peace treaty, budding peace treaty between Israel and UAE is the best seen by Hezbollah, by Turkey, by Iran. Those have been the three Middle Eastern countries who have been the most against what's been happening. And when we look at Iran, a bit further away, Iran has its fingers and its fingerprints in 2020, both in Iraq and in Syria, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. And it brings me into that 2020 world where everybody gets a moment to look at a table. And I hope that you can see it. And assuming you can see it, I have to put my glasses on, otherwise I can't see it. But things that you discover in the world of COVID-19. One, I wanted to see what was happening with Israel. I'll talk about Israel in a moment. But this is the official, it's from last night. I take it every night, the official World Health Organization's table showing us the COVID-19 daily update. And you'll notice that Israel is not on the table of the region of the Eastern Mediterranean. And I looked outside the window and thought, I'm pretty near the Mediterranean. Why am I not in this table? But I want you to look at Iran. Because Iran, ladies and gentlemen, is not only, I go backwards, exporting arms, know-how, wars, Qasem Soleimani and the Al-Quds, they are exporting COVID-19. The numbers of death in Iran, and these are the official numbers, the numbers are probably higher, they have surpassed 20,000 people. They are almost, if you look at the numbers of the greater Middle East, 47,000, but the countries of the World Health Organization, as they saw the Eastern Mediterranean, is from Morocco all the way to Pakistan, without Israel, but with the occupied Palestinian territories. But Iran itself is over 20,000 of the deaths. They have been at the center, the epicenter of exporting that within the greater Middle East. And when we think of what we're facing in the Middle East of 2020, we think again, war and peace. Is this not the war that we're all in right now? And look at where Iran is with all of those other countries there. Second aspect of this table, which I find amusing because you have to have a cynical sense of humor if you live in the Middle East, is when I wanted to go and find what Israel was doing. I wanted to find out how we were compared to our arena. And I discovered that in the World Health Organization, we are not in the Eastern Mediterranean. So just so that everybody doesn't go, like, oh no, right? We're in Europe. I'll get back to that moment. We're in Europe. And it's kind of funny. I don't know how much I'll be able to really do that, but I don't know if you can actually see what I'm doing now, so it doesn't really matter. Can you see what I'm doing now? You see that it's, because little Israel there, Israel, the total cases, it shows our numbers. Just like in the Eurovision and other things, we're in Europe. In the World Health Organization, we're in Europe. But I go backwards a sec, okay, as I do that there. And I remind you that on the map of the World Health Organization, or the table of the Eastern Mediterranean, you have the occupied Palestinian territory, that there are two stars there that tell us that the data here includes East Jerusalem. And when you look at the data of COVID-19 in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, and overwhelmingly right now in the southern West Bank, that is one of those aspects of, don't you all want to be on the same page? Isn't this a battle that we're all supposed to battle together? And I said this evening, I'm in the war and peace, which is going to end with UAE, which is happy, but most of it is not happy. In the war against COVID-19, and I'm calling it a war. That's one of the main battles that we're all trying to battle right now. The Palestinian Authority, for the last 2 months, has stopped all of its coordination with Israel. You know that term, cut off your nose to spite your face? They would not accept 2 months ago from the United Arab Emirates equipment for hospitals, equipment to help them out, because it came through the Israeli port, because it came through the Israeli airport. The Gaza Strip has, over the last few days, as I go forward in that sense, I put this up for you right now, the last 2 weeks we have seen a huge spike in the terror incendiary balloon attacks. There are a lot of photos online that you can see of this. So here we are, COVID-19. You'd think that we all have something in common. No, the area right now of the balloons coming on and in, including just today, around 25 different incidents, 17 different fires. Just before we started to talk, there was a siren and warning of incoming rockets. And then my cynicism comes out again because they fired rockets towards the city of Sderot today, but they fell in Gazan territory, meaning the rockets were duds. So I'm sorry, my cynicism comes out. You know, they fired rockets at Israel and the rockets fell inside the Gaza Strip. Are we going to be blamed for that also? And I give that within this world of the war and peace, things are not always easy. I'm skipping just to the last thing, and I'll open it up for the last 5 minutes of questions. That when we look at the greater Middle East, at war and peace in 2020, I want us all to note, I said I'm not going to be, the only happy aspect is the UAE, but I want you to read what the Prime Minister, now President, of Turkey said in May of this year during COVID-19 with everything else going on. This is, you know, like you look at that and you think, who said this, right? If we lose Jerusalem, we will not be able to protect Medina. I mean, here I am, you know, Yerushalayim and the centrality. If we lose Medina, we cannot protect Mecca. If Mecca falls, we will lose the Kaaba. And take note, Jerusalem is the eternal capital of Palestine. And the man who said this in May is none other than the president of Turkey. And when we look at these different aspects and we think of UAE signed a peace treaty because of everything that I just said, because Israel is at the forefront of technology. Because right now where we are the ones who are standing up to Iran, to Hezbollah, to Turkey, to those countries that are viewed right now as supporting extreme Islamists who are Shiite and extreme Islamists who are Sunni. And UAE signed a peace treaty yesterday evening. The Foreign Ministry of UAE put out Historic Week of Peace, Shabbat Shalom. That is from the Director of Strategic Communications, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who said to us yesterday, Shabbat Shalom. So if we're talking about the Middle East of 2020, big extremes and how that goes out. I talked an enormous amount about all sorts of different things. I'm going to stop sharing right now. I get my full screen here with the enormous amount of chats. Sean, tell me if there are any questions that I should be addressing.
Miri, thank you. That was extraordinary tour de force. I'm sure everyone enjoyed it. Two questions, if you wouldn't mind. One from Gerald Levine. Egypt wants Gaza for internal security, but they want a UN mandate to administer Gaza. Can you explain that? And then the other question from Dion Pink is, how does the Sunni-Shia divide affect stability in the Middle East? If you can deal with those two, that would be amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the questions. So contrary to what most people think, Egypt never took over in the Gaza Strip. Egypt never, God, why am I suddenly losing my English, which is a very odd thing to happen to me, as I say to myself right now. Egypt never, sipach, never, God, somebody say it in Hebrew, in English, lo sipachno, blah, 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 did not annex, did not apply Egyptian law to the Gaza Strip ever, meaning Egypt never saw the Gaza Strip as part of Egypt. So that when we talk about the fact that they want Egypt to have a clear-cut border with the Gaza Strip, and they in Egypt over the last 7 years outlawed Hamas. Egypt, call Hamas like we do, a terror organization, and they see Hamas as the reason that the very extreme Salafi Sunni groups in Sinai are attacking Egyptians in Egyptian Sinai. So that Egypt right now is very clear cut. Hamas is a terror organization. They're the ones that, because of them, there are so many weapons inside Sinai that are attacking Egyptian forces in Sinai, so that they want as much as possible, to cut off that line of weapons going into the Gaza Strip. UN forces, that's not, it's just that they don't want to go in themselves. Israel doesn't want to go in there. And all I can say to everybody who's listening to us, nobody wants to go into the Gaza Strip. And I'm not, my cynicism comes out. The Gaza Strip is a harsh, challenging place. It's a tragedy of the world, certainly for the people who live there. They are ruled by Hamas. That doesn't mean that everybody's like that. And overwhelmingly, they are both poor and victims. Egypt doesn't want them. Let's be honest. Israel doesn't want them. And they are in between a rock and a hard place. And as such, there is no easy resolution for that. When it comes to the second question about the Sunni Shiite divide, there are many people who view different ways of the Middle East and see the Islamic divide and Islam in general as being the main instigator, the main driving force inside the Middle East and North Africa. There's no question whatsoever that people's self-identity, remember my enormous youth from before, their self-identity is very much also through their religious affiliation. If they're Sunni, that's one thing. If they're Shiite, that's another thing. But every single one of you, and I'm seeing here hundreds of faces inside the Zoom, do all of you have one identity? I'm not going to call you by names as I'm looking at the endless pages of people. I'm Miri. What am I supposed to say? Am I more of an Israeli or more of a Jew? Am I more of a woman or more of a colonel? Am I more of a mother or more of a wife? I have multiple identities, and when you think about it to yourself, you never define yourself by one. Even people who are very religious in that sense. And overwhelmingly, that Sunni Shiite divide is one which has been very much brought up, especially by geopolitics, meaning Iran is Shiite. Iran overwhelmingly tries to connect to Shiites all over the greater Middle East and the world, using them from Pakistan and all the way, through Africa, etc. But Iran is also a Persian-speaking country, not Arabic-speaking. Those are different cultures, those are different backgrounds. So the Sunni Shiite divide makes a difference, but to emphasize that point, right now, besties, y'all know BFFs, Turkey's Erdogan, and Iran's president and supreme leader. Ladies and gentlemen, Turkey is totally Sunni, and Iran is pretty much Shiite. And yet they're happily in bed together right now because they have geopolitical interests that go together.
Miri, thank you so much. There are tons of questions, but unfortunately we've run out of time. You've been fantastic. Post-COVID, we look forward to having you back in South Africa, and we really do thank you. And if everyone could show their appreciation on Limud in the appropriate, on Zoom, apologies, in the appropriate way. Miri, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us. And if you can move across back to the main room, Howie and Adina will talk to the other panelists so you can face that very difficult Limud choice again of who to pick. But Miri, you've been fantastic. We really do appreciate it. Thank you very much.
A real pleasure, Shavua Tov, and I'm sorry that I tried to push so much into 45 minutes.
It was wonderful.